If your ancestors could see you learning this, subscribe and honor the story by sharing it forward. They built an empire that stretched from the banks of the Indus to the edge of Bengal, and for 3 centuries it stood as the largest political power North India had seen since the Guptas. Historians place its rise around 650 CE and its final collapse near 1036 CE. Its rulers are remembered in temple inscriptions as protectors of Dharma, breakers of foreign armies, defenders of a Hindu heartland against invasion from the west. Every textbook account of this dynasty tells the same story: native soil, native blood, native cause. But the name their enemies used for them tells a different story. Not the name the dynasty gave itself, the name outsiders gave them. The neighboring kingdoms, the rival courts, the chroniclers writing from a safe distance. That name appears, almost word for word, in inscriptions from a full century earlier, attached not to a Hindu royal house but to a wave of Central Asian horsemen who had already broken the Gupta Empire nearly in half. Same word, different century, different army. That is not supposed to happen. Ethnic labels do not usually recycle themselves across a hostile invasion and a celebrated native dynasty by pure coincidence. And it raises a question that a lot of modern political identity has been built on top of, without ever really answering it. If the dynasty that saved Hindustan from foreign conquest was itself descended from foreign conquerors, does that make them defenders, or something else entirely? Here is the story as it is usually told. The dynasty is called the Gurjara Pratiharas, though they called themselves simply Pratihara, doorkeeper, a title according to their own court poets, inherited from Lakshmana, brother of Rama, who stood guard at the gates of Ayodhya in the Ramayana. The claim is written into stone. The 837 CE Jodhpur inscription of the Mandor branch of the family lays out this descent explicitly, tying the ruling house to the oldest and most sacred genealogy Hindu India has to offer. Not a foreign myth, not a borrowed myth. The myth. The mainstream historical explanation for the second half of their name, Gurjara, has nothing to do with bloodline at all. Historians like R.C. Majumdar have argued for decades that Gurjara was simply a place, a region called Gurjara Desa, covering roughly the territory of southern Rajasthan and northern Gujarat today. On this account, the ruling clan governed that region, and the region's name stuck to them the way a title sticks to an office. A Yorkshireman today isn't necessarily descended from Vikings just because Yorkshire once was. Geography, not genealogy. That's the official story, and for most of the 20th century, it was close to unchallenged. The political history built on top of that story is substantial. The dynasty rose from a scatter of feudatory clans centered on Mandor, near modern Jodhpur, and was consolidated into an imperial power under a ruler named Nagabhata I. His successor, Nagabhata II, is credited with pushing back Arab forces that had been advancing steadily east since the conquest of Sind in 712 CE. A real, dated, documented military threat, and the dynasty's founding claim to legitimacy as the shield of North India. The empire reached its territorial peak under Mihira Bhoja and Mahendrapala I in the 9th century, when Pratihara-controlled land is said to have stretched from the Sutlej River in the northwest to the borders of Bengal in the east. That is not a regional kingdom. That is one of the largest political entities the subcontinent had seen in 500 years. They built like people, building a permanent legacy. Temple patronage across Rajasthan and central India, formal Vaishnava religious identity, court inscriptions that invoke Kshatriya dharma and trace descent through solar and lunar royal lineages, the standard vocabulary any indigenous Hindu ruling house used to assert legitimacy. Even outside sources support the geographic picture. The Chinese Buddhist traveler Xuanzang, writing in the 7th century, describes a kingdom he calls Qiu Che Lo, with a capital called Pilo Milo, which historians place squarely in Gurjara territory, decades before the dynasty's imperial phase even began. This is the version most people learn. A native Rajasthani warrior clan, tempered by the fight against Arab expansion, that grew into a pan-Indian empire and helped lay the genetic and political foundation of the Rajput system that would define North Indian nobility for the next 1,000 years. Clean story, complete story, satisfying story. Except for one detail that refuses to sit still. The word Gurjara does not appear anywhere in Indian sources before the 6th century CE. Not in an inscription, not in a text, not once. And the 6th century CE happens to be exactly the moment a very different, very foreign army was tearing through the same stretch of geography this dynasty would later call home. Here is where it gets complicated. The term Gurjara enters the historical record only after the Hunik invasions of North India, roughly 470 to 528 CE, specifically after a group called the Alchan Huns, a branch of the Hephthalites, the so-called White Huns of Central Asia, shattered Gupta imperial authority under commanders remembered by name, Toramana, and his son Mihirakula, a ruler so violent that Buddhist chronicles single him out centuries later as a symbol of foreign cruelty. This was not a border skirmish. This was an empire-ending invasion, and the word Gurjara shows up in the wreckage almost immediately afterward. Historians noticed this timing a long time before genetics existed to test it. The early 20th century scholar V.A. Smith argued outright that the Gurjaras were foreign immigrants, most likely a branch of the Hephthalites themselves. D.R. Bhandarkar went further. He proposed that Gujar was nothing more than the Sanskritized version of a Central Asian tribal name, and he pointed to place names surviving in Central Asia today, Gurjistan among them, as linguistic fossils, footprints left behind by a migration nobody wrote down in full. Not everyone agreed on the details. General Cunningham, working the same evidence, rejected the Hunik connection entirely and instead linked the Gurjaras to the Yuezhi, also known as the Tocharians, a completely different Central Asian steppe population, with a completely different migration history. Three respected historians, three different foreign homelands. The one thing they agreed on was that foreign belonged in the sentence at all. That's the historical anomaly. The genetic one is newer and stranger. Modern population geneticists model South Asian ancestry as a blend of three deep source populations: ancestral North Indians, ancestral South Indians, and a Bronze Age steppe component that arrived roughly 2,000 to 1,500 years before the Common Era. Think of these not as three separate ingredients still sitting in the bowl, but as three colors of paint mixed so long ago that no modern person is any one of them. Only the blend. This framework comes largely from Narasimhan, Patterson, and David Reich's landmark 2019 study in the journal Science, produced out of the Reich Lab at Harvard Medical School, built from ancient DNA recovered across South and Central Asia. Within that established framework, something doesn't line up. Some research on Rajput clan populations has reported that communities identifying specifically as Gurjar or Gurjara carry a slightly different genetic signature than other Rajput lineages, marginally elevated Central Asian-related ancestry, and notably, detectable frequencies of a Y chromosome lineage called QM242. Think of a Y chromosome lineage as a surname passed silently from father to son for thousands of years, invisible but traceable if you know how to read it. QM242 is not the surname most of North India carries. Most upper caste and Indo-Aryan associated populations carry a lineage called R18Z93, tied to that earlier Bronze Age steppe migration 2,000 years before this dynasty existed. QM242 is a different name entirely, tied to Central and Inner Asian populations much closer to the Hunik and Turkic sphere. Two different steppe signals, separated not by decades, not by generations, by centuries. If the Gurjara anomaly holds up under further study, it doesn't point back to the same Bronze Age migration everyone already knew about. It points to a second, much later wave of Central Asian ancestry, arriving a full 2,500 years after the first one had already settled into the subcontinent's genetic bedrock. Researchers working in this space are careful to frame this as a probability worth investigating, not a settled certainty. The sample sizes in some of this work are small, and self-identified Gurjar populations today are not a clean stand-in for a 6th century royal court. But the timing is difficult to ignore, and it forces an uncomfortable rereading of the just a place name theory from a moment ago. That theory assumes the region was named first, and the people who ruled it took the name second, entirely incidentally. But if a distinct population with a distinct genetic signature shows up in the historical and genetic record at almost exactly the same moment the word Gurjara shows up in the epigraphic record, the sequence might run the other way. A people may have arrived first. The territory may have been named after them, which is precisely the pattern foreign origin historians were arguing for 100 years before there was any DNA evidence available to test it against. So which invader were they descended from, if they were invaders at all? The mainstream historical answer has a name, and it isn't a genetic one. The oldest and most cited explanation for the word Gurjara isn't genetic, it's political geography, and it comes from historians like R.C. Majumdar and Baijnath Puri. Gurjara was simply the name of a place, Gurjara Desa, and the Pratihara clan absorbed that name by governing the territory, with no bloodline implication whatsoever. The evidence for this is stronger than it might sound. Across the roughly dozen major inscriptions historians attribute to the Pratihara dynasty, only a single one, the Rajor or Alwar inscription, uses the compound phrase Gurjara Pratiharan, meaning of the Pratihara lineage of the Gurjaras. One inscription, out of a dozen, meaning in something like 90% of the dynasty's own primary written record, they never called themselves Gurjara at all, only Pratihara, tied cleanly back to the Lakshmana myth. If this was their ethnic identity, they were remarkably quiet about it in their own words. But the theory has a problem it cannot fully explain away. Hostile neighboring dynasties, the Rashtrakutas to the south, the Palas to the east, did not stay quiet about it. They reached for the word Gurjara again and again in their own inscriptions, and not as a neutral geographic label. The 808 CE Radanpur copper plates of the Rashtrakuta king Govinda III describe the humiliation of the Gurjara in language built for mockery, not cartography. Insults tend to target identity. Rarely do rival kings taunt each other over which zip code they administer. The territorial theory also has nothing to say about why Gurjara survives today as a place name in Central Asia. Gurjistan, thousands of miles from Gurjara Desa. And it has nothing to say about why the word's very first appearance in Indian history lines up, almost to the decade, with the collapse of Gupta power under Hunik invasion, rather than with any earlier or later moment in Rajasthani political history. The territorial theory explains the paperwork. It doesn't explain the timing, it doesn't explain the insults, and it doesn't explain the DNA. There's a second, far more complicated explanation, and it starts with an army of white Huns who never fully went home. They didn't just raid North India and disappear back over the mountains. Some scholars argue they stayed, they intermarried, they rebranded. The scholarship here comes largely from the historian Étienne de la Vessière, whose work on the Hephthalites places their original base in the Oxus Basin of Central Asia, the river system running through modern Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. Through their Alchon branch, these were the same white Huns who seized control of Gandhara, the region straddling modern northern Pakistan and eastern Afghanistan, by around 465 CE. From Gandhara, they fanned outward, North India, West India, Central India, not as a single raiding column, but as a sustained, generational occupation. The theory built on top of that fact is a fusion theory. Not the Gurjaras were Huns, something messier, Hunik military elites, small in number but dominant in force, marrying into local populations, blending into them, and within a few generations, becoming politically indistinguishable from them. One modern synthesis of this argument describes the resulting Gurjara Pratiharas as likely a fusion of Altain Hun and native Indian elements. Functionally a Hunik-descended political structure, even while acknowledging its precise origins remain genuinely unclear. Here is where the evidence stops being purely textual and starts being physical. The Pratihara dynasty's royal titling leans heavily on the cult of Varaha, the boar avatar of the god Vishnu, tearing the earth up from the cosmic ocean. It shows up again and again in their inscriptions, their iconography, their self-description as protectors of the world. Some historians argue this wasn't an organic outgrowth of an old local tradition. It was an import, a foreign warrior elite reaching for an Indian deity that could double as a symbol of political legitimacy, the way a new regime adopts a national flag it didn't design but needs the public to salute anyway. Then there's the money. Gaudia coins, a debased silver currency descended directly from Sasanian Persian prototypes, are found concentrated specifically in historically Gurjara-controlled territory. Persian coin templates, the same coin family the Hephthalites themselves used and spread across their conquered territories. That's not a coincidence of trade routes. That's continuity, an economic culture carried over from the Hunik period straight into the Pratihara period, with no clean break in between. And the timing is tight. The Alkan Huns take Gandhara around 465 CE. The word Gurjara makes its first clear appearance as a political and ethnic term in Indian sources within roughly 60 to 70 years of that date. 60 to 70 years is not centuries of slow cultural drift. It's one displaced generation. A child born in the chaos of the invasion, watching his own name become a kingdom's name by the time he was old enough to rule. The theory has a real gap, and honest researchers say so. There is no surviving inscription, not one, where any Pratihara ruler explicitly claims Hunik descent. Nothing carved in stone says my grandfather rode with Toramana. The entire case is built from timing, from coinage, from religious practice. Circumstantial evidence, stacked high enough to be compelling, but never a signed confession. But circumstantial evidence has a way of quietly demolishing the theory that came before it. Go back to the territorial name argument, the clean, comfortable story that Gurjara was just a place, and the ruling family picked up the label the way anyone inherits a zip code. A place doesn't mint its own silver currency copied from Persian Hunik templates. A place doesn't import a new state deity and center a royal identity around it. Territories don't do that. Conquering, settling elites do. That's the second theory. It complicates. It doesn't resolve, and underneath it there's a third possibility, one that most researchers are hesitant to say out loud because it doesn't offer a single villain, a single invasion, a single clean date to point to. The third theory isn't Hun. It isn't purely local either. It reaches back further than the 5th century, and it comes less from historians than from geneticists working directly with living populations. Y chromosome research on modern Gujar communities, specifically a published study on Gujars from the Jammu region of northern India, found something that doesn't fit either of the first two boxes cleanly. Think of a Y chromosome study as reading the return address on a package that's been resealed 100 times. It can't tell you everything about what's inside, but it can tell you, with real precision, roughly where the package first shipped from. And the return address on the Jammu Gujar package doesn't point cleanly to Central Asia by way of the Huns. It points toward the nomadic Pashtun populations of Afghanistan's Baghlan and Kunduz provinces, and toward Pashtun and Sindhi populations in Pakistan, genetic neighbors that sit outside the tidy Hunik invasion timeline altogether. That finding pushes the story sideways instead of backward. It suggests not one clean wave of Hunik migration, but multiple, overlapping waves of Central Asian and Iranic borderland gene flow, arriving across centuries rather than in a single dramatic invasion. Layered on top of the Hephthalite episode, there may be older Kushan-era movement, the Yuezhi, the Tocharians, the very steppe group General Cunningham pointed to more than a century ago, at a time when nobody had any way to test his idea. Layered on top of that, later Turco-Iranic contact along Afghan trade and pastoral corridors, migrations too small and too gradual to leave behind a monument or an inscription, but not too small to leave behind a genetic signature. The same Jammu study found something else worth sitting with. The Gujar population it examined shows measurably lower genetic diversity than the neighboring Ladakhi population studied alongside it. Lower diversity is what you'd expect from a smaller founding population. A group that arrived relatively few in number, specialized as pastoralists, and expanded from there, rather than a population that had simply always been in place, absorbing genetic diversity from its neighbors for millennia. It's the genetic footprint of migrants who kept mostly to themselves, not a footprint of deep, undifferentiated local roots. There's an older data point that fits into this same picture. A 1988 study by researchers R.S. Balgar and J.C. Sharma, published in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, documented distinct genetic marker frequencies between Hindu and Muslim Gujar populations of northwestern India, two communities sharing the same name, the same clan identity, and, apparently, not quite the same underlying genetic history. Put together, that's not one migration story. It might be several, folded into a single political and clan label somewhere along the way, until nobody, not the Pratihara court, not their rivals, not modern historians, could fully untangle which thread came from where. None of this proves a single point of origin. Researchers working in this space are careful to frame it that way, not as an answer but as a complication. One more layer sitting on top of layers already there. Picture the frontier where this dynasty first took shape. Mandor, a hill fort of dusty red sandstone near what is now Jodhpur, the earliest real power base of the Pratihara line, long before their court moved east to the wealth of Kanuj. Around it, the scrubland of Marwar, the hard, dry edge of the Thar Desert, a landscape of seasonal wells and thin grazing land, built for cattle and horses more than for wheat and rice. It is, geographically, almost identical to the terrain the steppe migrants of Central Asia had been herding across for generations before they ever crossed into India, which is not a coincidence, but a pattern. Pastoralist populations do not scatter randomly when they migrate. They look for land that behaves like the land they left. Stand there in the early decades of the 8th century, and the news moving through that fort is not abstract. Arab raiding parties are pushing east out of newly conquered Sind, a threat with a specific date attached, 712 CE, and a specific advancing edge. The military clans gathering at Mandor are positioning themselves as the answer to that threat, the line that holds. And by one reading of everything just laid out, the men doing the holding may themselves be the grandsons, or great-grandsons, of a different invasion entirely. a people who crossed into this same frontier from the north 2 or 3 generations earlier, in the wake of the Hunik collapse of Gupta power, and are now standing on the western edge of that same frontier as its defenders. Nagabata I's resistance against those Arab advances in the early to mid-8th century is the documented, dated event this moment is building toward. A real battle, not atmosphere. But the irony sitting underneath it doesn't need to be spoken aloud. A frontier people, whoever their fathers had been, were about to be defined completely by what they stood against, and almost nothing was going to be remembered about what they'd once come from. Here's the reframe that changes how every fact in this story should be read. The entire debate has been built on a binary. Were the Gurjara Pratiharas foreign, or were they indigenous? Pick one, defend it. But nothing assembled here, not the anomaly, not the Hunik fusion theory, not the layered Y chromosome evidence, actually supports a binary answer. It supports something closer to a layered one. Start with an indigenous population base across Rajasthan and Gujarat, already a deep mixture of ancestral South Indian ancestry, ancient Iranian farmer ancestry, and an earlier Bronze Age steppe component. The same 3-part blend, Narasimhan, Patterson, and Reich's 2019 science study describes for South Asians broadly. Onto that already mixed foundation, add a second, much later, much smaller wave of Central Asian steppe and Hunnic-adjacent ancestry, arriving during the chaos of the 5th and 6th centuries. Then watch that new arrival re-indigenize, politically and culturally, astonishingly fast, adopting Vaishnava religion, adopting Kshatriya genealogical myth, adopting Sanskrit court language and epic ancestry claims so completely that within roughly 150 to 200 years, the descendants of steppe invaders were leading the empire that resisted the next invasion. Not by years, by generations, and it was over. The outsiders had become, in every practical and cultural sense, thoroughly Indian. That speed is the real finding here. It means foreign and indigenous are not opposite ends of a fixed scale. They're stages a population can move through inside a human lifetime and a half, faster than most national origin stories are comfortable admitting. Line the numbers up and the picture sharpens further. Bronze Age steppe ancestry sits at somewhere between 5 and 35% across the general South Asian population today, according to Narasimhan's data. An old, deep, thoroughly blended signal. Layered on top of that, in specific Gurjara-identified clans, is a proposed second and much smaller steppe addition, centuries later, from a completely different direction. If both signals are real, the Gurjara Pratiharas aren't a single origin story at all. They're a palimpsest, one migration's genetic handwriting partially erased and written over by another on a page that already had several layers of older handwriting underneath both of them. This is the part that should reframe the cold open. The men who framed themselves as saviors of Hindustan, doorkeepers descended from the brother of Rama, almost certainly were not lying. Not in any way they themselves would have recognized. Dynasties tend to believe their own genealogical myths within a few generations of inventing them. But the land they were defending had already been doing this same trick for thousands of years before they arrived, absorbing wave after wave of outsiders, rewriting their identity, and handing them the deed to being native once the paperwork caught up. The Gurjara Pratiharas may simply be the most recent, and the most politically successful, group this subcontinent ever performed that trick on. Zoom out, and the pattern stops being specific to one Indian dynasty. Nearly every population history remembers as indigenous defenders was, a few centuries earlier, cast as the foreign invader in somebody else's origin story. The Rajputs, the Franks who became the face of native French identity centuries after crossing the Rhine. The Anglo-Saxons who became the English after arriving as outsiders on an island that already belonged to someone else. Identity, in every one of these cases, is not a fixed starting point. It's a snapshot, taken at one moment, of a migration that never actually finished. This isn't only a question for historians. Gujar and Gurjara descended communities across modern India and Pakistan number in the tens of millions today, and many remain actively engaged in real political movements around caste status and tribal classification. Movements where these exact, centuries-old origin questions carry direct legal and economic weight. A community elder in a Gujar village today, asked where his people came from, is likely to answer with total, unhesitating confidence. Solar lineage, native soil, always here. He is not wrong to believe it. He is simply standing at the same distance from his own origin story that a 9th century Pratihara king stood from his. And the honest caveat has to sit right alongside that confidence. Everything laid out here is built on modern proxy populations, living communities sampled today and projected backward, not on direct ancient DNA pulled from a confirmed 6th to 9th century Pratihara burial site. That test, the one that could actually settle this, has not been done at scale. The bones that could close this case are, as far as the public record shows, still in the ground. Every generation redraws this same document, writing its own certainty directly over the erased certainty of the one before it, until no single layer can be read in isolation anymore, only the accumulated shape of all of them together. The Gurjara Pratiharas may never be who we thought they were, not because the truth is being hidden, but because the DNA hasn't finished revealing it.